On a bright June morning in Montana, an old German shepherd lifted his gray head and pulled his owner toward the canyon, 3 full seconds before any human could hear the cry for help. The FBI agent holding his leash once saved him from a roadside, never knowing he'd been waiting for her. Below those cliffs, a stranger was already falling. If you believe God still speaks through the faithful, leave amen. The morning came to Larkspur Hollow, the way good mornings always did in early June, slow and golden, as if the valley were still deciding whether to wake at all. Jessica Ward stood on the back porch of her father's house with a chipped enamel mug warming both her hands, and she watched the North Fork run silver and swollen below the tree line. The river had been fed all week by snowmelt off the high country, and it carried the cold straight down from the peaks, so that even here, where the sun lay warm across the porch boards, the air off the water smelled like winter remembering itself. The larch had turned that tender, almost unreal green they only wore for a few weeks each year, and along the fence the dogwood had opened white, careless and bright, like someone had scattered handfuls of paper across the dark branches. Jessica had spent 11 years away from this valley, and in all that time she had never found a coffee anywhere that tasted the way her father's did out here. It was not the coffee. She knew that. It was the porch, the river, the smell of pine pitch warming in the light. Some flavors lived in places, not in cups. She was 36 now, though the work she did had a way of adding years she did not always feel. She was tall and built lean and economical, the kind of strong that came from use rather than vanity. With dark hair she kept pulled back at the nape of her neck and a few early threads of gray she had stopped pretending not to see. Her face was angular, watchful, slow to smile, but honest when it did, and there were faint lines at the corners of her eyes that came from squinting into hard country and harder situations. She wore an old flannel shirt that had once been her father's, the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and she stood the way people stand when they have learned to read a place before trusting it. 11 years in the Bureau had sharpened that habit into something close to instinct. But this week she was off the clock, home on leave, and she was trying, with limited success, to remember how to simply stand still. At her feet lay Rin. The old German shepherd was stretched along the warm boards in a patch of sun, but even asleep he did not look like a dog at rest. He lay with his chin on his paws and his hindquarters folded carefully under him, positioned so that one open eye could track both the kitchen door and the steps down to the yard. His coat was black and tan gone slightly dull with age, thick at the ruff, thinning a little along the flanks. A pale streak of fur ran beneath his left eye like a scar that had never quite been a wound. He was 11 now, give or take, because no one had ever known his true birthday, and the years showed in the gray that had crept up his muzzle, and in the stiffness that settled into his right hip when the weather turned damp. But his ears still worked the way younger dogs' ears never did, swiveling toward sounds that hadn't arrived yet, and his amber eyes still held that steady, assessing patience that had unsettled Jessica from the first day she met him. She had found him 11 years ago, half-starved and abandoned at the edge of a county road, while she was driving to a scene she would rather forget. He had been waiting there like he expected someone. She had never been able to shake the feeling that the someone turned out to be her. "You planning to drink that, or just bond with it?" Her father's voice came through the screen door. Tom Ward was 68, broad through the shoulders, and gone soft only where age insisted, with a white mustache and a face weathered to the color and texture of old saddle leather. He had spent 30 years jumping out of airplanes into burning forests as a smoke jumper, and another decade after that running volunteer search and rescue out of these same mountains, and his body carried the record of it. A knee that clicked, 2 fingers that had never set quite right, a slight permanent lean to the left as though he were always bracing into a wind only he could feel. He was the gentlest hard man Jessica had ever known. He pushed the door open with his hip, set a second mug on the railing, and lowered himself into the rocker with the careful negotiation of a man whose body had become a committee. "I taught you better than to stand around looking at water," he said. "You used to read it." "I still read it." Jessica nodded toward the North Fork. "It's running high, too high for June. Big snow year up top. It'll come down hard for another 2-3 weeks." He took a slow sip. "Forecast's got a cold front pushing in off the divide tomorrow night, maybe sooner. They're saying it could drop snow on the high passes. In June." He shook his head with the particular disgust of a man who had stopped being surprised by mountains a long time ago and resented being surprised now. "Hatcher Pass'll be a mess if anybody's fool enough to be up there." "Nobody's that fool." "You'd be amazed." He smiled into his cup. "People come out here from the cities thinking the calendar means something to a mountain." Jessica let the quiet settle. This was what she had come home for, though she would not have said it plainly. Not the rest exactly, the familiarity, the way her father could say 3 sentences about the weather and have them mean "I'm glad you're here, and I worry about you, and I don't know how to say either of those things." She crouched and ran her hand down Rin's neck, and the old dog leaned into the touch without opening his eyes, a slow, easy pressure that said he trusted her completely, and would still hear the first car a mile off before she did. Then a sound, a single sharp note from somewhere down the valley, metal on stone, or maybe a gate latch, or maybe nothing, and Rin came up off the boards all at once, ears rigid, body gone still and electric, staring at the tree line with an attention so total that the warm morning seemed to flinch around him. Jessica froze with her hand still half raised. She had seen this before, not often. A handful of times in 11 years, always tied to the same narrow band of sound, some pitch or pattern she had never managed to identify, and every time it happened, the dog became someone else for a moment, something older and trained and far away, and then it passed, and he was only Rin again, her old shepherd with the gray muzzle and the bad hip. She had asked the vet about it once. She had asked herself about it more. She had never gotten an answer. The morning held its breath. Then Rin's ears softened, and the moment let them go. "He still do that?" her father asked quietly. "Once in a while." Jessica watched the dog settle, though not all the way down this time, his weight still forward, still listening. "I've never figured out what sets him off. 11 years, and I still don't know half of what's in that head." "Dogs keep their histories," Tom said. "Same as people. You just don't always get to read the file." He said it lightly, but his eyes had gone to the dog with something careful in them, and Jessica filed the look away the way she filed everything without quite knowing why. They sat a while longer in the lengthening light. The valley warmed. A pair of mountain bluebirds worked the fence posts, and the river kept up its low, cold argument with the stones, and for a stretch of minutes Jessica let herself believe she was only a daughter on a porch, and not a person whose phone could ring at any hour with the worst day of a stranger's life on the other end. She finished her father's coffee. She thought about nothing, on purpose, and found she was almost good at it. Then Rin stood. He did not startle this time. He simply rose, slow and deliberate, and turned to face west, toward the ridge where the land folded down into the steep granite throat the locals called Sweetgrass Canyon. His good ear and his torn one both swung forward. A low sound came out of him, not quite a growl, more like a question pressed flat against his teeth, and he took 2 stiff steps toward the porch rail and stopped, looking back at her, then west again, the way he had looked back at her on that county road 11 years ago, when he had decided she was the one he had been waiting for. "Rin!" Jessica was already on her feet. "What is it?" The dog pulled toward the canyon, whining now, urgent. And 3 full seconds later, thin and far, and carried on the cold breath of the river, the first human cry for help reached the porch. Jessica did not remember deciding to run. One moment she was on the porch with her father's empty mug in her hand, and the next she was moving down the slope toward the truck with Rin laboring at her heel, the old dog's bad hip be damned, and the cry still hanging in the cold air behind her like something that refused to fall. Tom was already shouting from the porch, telling her where the rope bag lived in the shed, telling her he'd call it in, telling her in the clipped shorthand of a man who had run 1,000 of these to keep her head and keep her feet. And she answered without turning, because there was no time to turn, and because some part of her had been waiting her whole life for exactly this, and hated that it was true. The drive to the canyon mouth took 6 minutes on the Washboard County Road, and she made it in 4. Sweetgrass Canyon was a steep granite throat where the North Fork narrowed and dropped, a place she had been warned away from as a girl, and had loved precisely for that reason, all gray rock and white water, and the kind of beauty that did not care whether you survived it. She stopped the truck at the trailhead, where the cell signal still held by a thread, and she did the thing her father had drilled into her before instinct could argue. She called it in. The county dispatcher's voice came thin and steady, and Jessica gave her the location, the nature of the call, a person in the water hazard at Sweetgrass, and the dispatcher told her what she already feared. The nearest rescue team was on the far side of the divide on another call, and the road over Hatcher Pass had a slide warning posted ahead of the incoming front, and the best estimate was 2 to 3 hours. 2 to 3 hours. Jessica looked down the trail toward the sound of the water and knew that a person on the rocks above that current did not have 2 to 3 hours. "Copy," she said. "I'm a federal agent, off duty, with rope experience and a search dog. I'm going down to assess. I'll lose signal in the canyon." She did not wait for permission. She shouldered the rope bag from the truck bed, and she went down into the throat of the canyon, and the signal died somewhere around the third switchback the way she had known it would. The trail dropped fast through wet rock and dripping moss, and the roar of the North Fork rose to meet her until it filled the whole world, a deep continuous thunder she felt in her sternum more than heard. The snowmelt had turned the river into something prehistoric, gray-green and muscular, throwing spray high enough to keep the rocks slick all the way up the bank. And there, 60 feet out and 12 feet above the worst of the current, on a sloping shelf of granite that the rising water was steadily reclaiming, was the person who had screamed. It was a young woman, maybe 25, slight and soaked to the bone, with dark hair plastered to her face and a yellow rain shell that had gone gray with spray. She was pressed flat against the rock with both arms wrapped around a small waterproof duffel as though the bag mattered more than her own balance. And even from the bank, Jessica could see her lips moving, talking to the bag, or to herself, or to someone who was not there. A camera strap crossed her chest. A field notebook had spilled half its pages into a crevice where the water was eating them one at a time. Whatever had brought her out onto that shelf, she had not come to throw herself off it. She had come to do something, and she had run out of rock before she finished. Then the light shifted. A single shaft of morning sun broke through the canyon rim and struck the spray, and for one suspended heartbeat, the whole gorge filled with a cold silver mist, shot through with rainbow, the river breathing fire and ice at once, beautiful and pitiless. And inside that glittering veil the young woman's small dark shape went very still, her face turning up toward the light, as if it were the last warm thing she expected to feel. Jessica's breath caught in her chest. She had seen the river do this 100 times as a girl, and had always thought it was the most gorgeous thing in the valley. She had never once stood in it, knowing a life was being measured against it. Then the mist tore apart on the wind, and the moment was gone, and the work began. "Hey!" Jessica cupped her hands. "I'm coming to you. Don't move. Hold what you've got." The woman's head turned, and the relief on her face was so total it nearly broke something open in Jessica's chest. Rin had come down the trail behind her, slower, favoring the hip, and now he paced the bank with his ears flat and his whole body strung tight, whining low, pushing his shoulder against the back of Jessica's knee in a way she had learned long ago meant Not that way, not yet. Wait. She did not have time to wait. She was already pulling the rope from the bag, scanning the bank for an anchor, when a voice came from the rocks downstream. "You go in alone. You're the second person I pull out today." He came over the boulders fast and sure-footed, a man in his late 30s, built like he'd been carved for hard country, broad through the chest and narrow at the hip, with a few days of dark stubble over a jaw that looked like it had been set by someone with a grudge against curves. His hair was cut short and going gray at the edges, and he had a long, pale scar that ran down the back of one forearm, and a way of moving that wasted nothing, every step placed, every glance counting exits. His eyes were a flat winter gray, and there was something behind them she recognized because she carried a version of it herself, a tightness that had nothing to do with the river. He wore a faded olive shirt and trail runners, and he carried his own coil of rope already in his hands. "Cole Brennan," he said, not slowing. "I was fishing the lower pools, heard her go in." "Jessica Ward, FBI, off duty. There's a team coming, but it's hours out." "Then it's us." He was already eyeing the rock, and Jessica saw at once that he knew what he was doing, and saw, half a second later, that he was about to do it wrong. He had picked a line straight out across the slick shelf toward the woman, fast and direct, and he had not stopped to build an anchor, had not tied in, had simply looped his rope once around a horn of granite and started to pay it out as he moved. "Brennan, stop. Anchor first." "No time. Water's coming up." "It's coming up slow." "You go out untied and slip. I've got nothing to hold you with, and 2 people in the river instead of 1. She heard her own voice drop into the flat command register she used at scenes, and to his credit he stopped, though every line of his body strained against it. "I build the anchor. You're stronger. You go to her on belay. We do this once, and we do it right." For a moment he just looked at her, and in that look she saw it plainly, the thing she'd half read from the start. He had not stopped because he agreed. He had stopped because he was trying, with visible effort, not to be the kind of man who charged in alone again. Whatever had happened to teach him that lesson, it had cost him enough that the wanting still showed. "Fine," he said, low. "Your anchor." "You always this agreeable?" "You always this bossy?" "Only when I'm right." She was already wrapping webbing around the base of a fractured spire, 2 wraps, a locking carabiner, testing it with her full weight. "Which is most of the time?" "Ask my father." Despite everything, a corner of his mouth moved, and the tightness in his eyes eased by a degree, and Jessica thought, good, because a man who could not bend even an inch under pressure was a man who would break. Rin had not eased at all. The old dog had moved to the water's edge and stood there rigid, staring at the shelf where the woman crouched, and he gave a single sharp bark, then another, the urgent commanding tone Jessica had only heard a handful of times in 11 years. "I know," she told him. "I know. Stay." He did not stay. He took 2 stiff steps onto the wet rock and stopped, looking back at her, and the dread that moved through her then had no name she could give it. They got Cole tied in. He went out across the shelf low and balanced, exactly the way Jessica would have, and the woman saw him coming and began to cry, still clutching the duffel, and Cole reached the edge of the dry rock and started talking to her in a voice gone suddenly gentle, telling her she was all right now, telling her to look at him and not the water. He was 8 feet from her. He shifted his weight to the next foothold, a broad, pale slab of granite, slick with the river's endless breath. And the slab moved. It had been wet all winter, and frost cracked at its root, and under his weight the whole face of it sheared loose with a sound like the canyon clearing its throat. And Cole Brennan dropped. Chapter 3. The fall. The rope saved his life, and it was not enough. Jessica felt the anchor take the load a half-second after the slab gave way, the webbing snapping taut against the fractured spire with a sound like a struck bowstring, and the granite horn held, and the carabiner held, and the line bit into her gloved hands as she threw her weight back against it. For one breath, she thought she had him. Then she understood the geometry of it, the way her father had taught her to understand falling things, fast and cold and without hope of changing them. Cole had been moving sideways across the shelf, not below the anchor, but out from it, and when the rock dropped him, the rope did not arrest a fall so much as convert it, swinging him hard in a long pendulum arc across the face of the lower ledge. And there was nothing she could do but hold and watch as he came down across the granite shoulder 12 feet below with the back of his head and his shoulder taking the impact together. The sound it made was not loud. That was the thing she would remember. A wet, final, ordinary sound, almost gentle, and then his body went loose against the rope and hung there, turning slowly in the spray. "Cole?" She had the line locked off before she finished saying it, both hands working without instruction from the part of her that had gone strangely quiet. "Cole, Brennan, talk to me." He did not answer. The river roared on, indifferent, and the young woman on the upper shelf was screaming something Jessica could not hear over the water, and Rin was barking, and the whole canyon had become a single wall of noise with one motionless man hanging in the middle of it. She lowered him. It took everything her father had ever put into her hands, feeding the rope a few inches at a time, keeping the line off the sharp edges until Cole's boots touched the broad flat rock at the base of the ledge and she could ease his weight down onto it. Then she went down the fixed line after him, fast, gloves smoking on the rope, and dropped to her knees beside him on the cold, wet granite. Blood from a gash above his left ear ran pink in the spray and was carried away almost as fast as it welled, which frightened her less than the alternative would have, because blood that flowed was blood that moved, and she had learned long ago which silences to fear. His eyes were half open. He was breathing. His pupils, when she checked them, were uneven. "Okay," she said, mostly to herself, dropping into the rhythm her father had drilled into her on 100 practice slopes before she was old enough to drive. "Okay, airway, breathing? You're breathing. Good. Don't you move your neck for me, you hear?" She got her jacket off and pressed it folded against the wound above his ear, firm and steady, and with her other hand she braced the side of his head, holding his spine in line the way you held a thing you could not afford to let shift. Her phone showed no bars. Of course it showed no bars. She was 60 feet down a granite throat with a man who needed a helicopter and a dog who needed her and a stranger on a rock the river was still climbing toward. And the only road out had a slide warning on it, and she was completely, perfectly alone. Then, through the thunder of the water, came a sound that did not belong to it, a single cracked, high cry, not human, breaking off sharp at the end. And Jessica's head came up to see Rin out on the wet rock 30 feet downstream, where he had picked his own way along a low ledge toward the trapped woman, and where his back legs had slipped on the slick granite and dropped him hard against the stone, and he lay now, half twisted, with one hind leg folded wrong beneath him, not struggling, only looking back at Jessica across the spray with those steady amber eyes, asking her, the way he had asked her on a county road 11 years ago, what she was going to do. The cold went all the way through her then, colder than the river. For one long, suspended moment the whole world narrowed to the space between a wounded man under her hands and a wounded dog she could not reach. And she could not have both at once, and the canyon held its breath and waited to see what she was made of. Then Cole groaned, and the moment shattered, and she came back into her body. Triage. The word her father had said until she hated it. You do not save who you love first. You save who dies first. Cole was unconscious, head injury, possible spine, but his airway was open and his bleeding was controlled, and he was, for this minute, stable. Rin was hurt and frightened and stranded, but Rin was breathing easy. Rin was alert. Rin had taken himself onto a ledge above the current and not into it, and the water, rising as it was, would not reach him for a while yet. It was the hardest arithmetic she had ever done, and it took her less than 2 seconds, and she hated that it took her so little time because it meant the training had finally gone all the way down to the bone. Rin. Her voice cracked and she steadied it. Stay, stay. And the old dog, who had not obeyed that word once all morning, lowered his head to the rock and held, trusting her, and the trust was almost worse than the disobedience. She worked on Cole. She got a better dressing on his head from the small kit in the rope bag, and she immobilized what she could with webbing and a folded sleeping pad, talking the whole time in a low, steady stream, because somewhere she had read that they could hear you, that the voice was a rope thrown down into the dark. You're all right. You took a fall, you cracked your hard head on Montana, that's all. I've seen worse on a Tuesday. Stay with me, Brennan. You owe me a fishing spot. His eyelids fluttered. His lips moved. She bent close. Danny, he said. Just that. A name formed carefully by a man 12 fathoms down in himself. Danny, hold the line. His hand rose an inch off the rock, reaching for something that was not there, closing on nothing, and his face in that moment was not the face of the controlled hard man who had told her she'd be the second person he pulled out today. It was younger and wide open and full of a grief so old it had worn a groove in him. I've got you, he said to the empty air. I've got you, I've got... And then he was gone again, sliding back under, and his hand came down, and Jessica knelt there with her jacket pressed to his head and understood that she had just seen the thing behind his eyes, the reason he had wanted to go out on that rock alone, the debt he had been trying to pay when the mountain dropped him. She did not know who Danny was. She knew exactly what he was. She carried a few names like that herself. Everyone who did this work long enough did. The light changed while she worked, and not the way it had before. The shaft of sun that had set the spray on fire was gone, and a flat gray was coming down over the canyon rim, the temperature dropping with it, the air going from cold to something with teeth in it. She looked up. Her father's voice came back to her from the porch that morning, easy and certain. Forecast's got a cold front pushing in off the divide. They're saying it could drop snow on the high passes. In June, it was coming early. It was coming now. And the rescue team that was 2 to 3 hours out was 2 to 3 hours out on the far side of Hatcher Pass, the same pass with the slide warning, the same pass that was the only road over the divide, which meant that even if they came, they were coming the long, slow way around. And the only direction that led out of this canyon under her own power led up the trail and over the high country and across the very pass the front was about to close. She looked at Cole, breathing shallow under her hands. She looked downstream at Rin, holding his stay on the wet rock, with his ruined leg folded under him and the water inching up the granite below. She looked at the young woman still clinging to her duffel above the rising river. Alive, waiting, out of time. 3 of them down here, and the cold coming and the easy way out already gone. All right, Jessica said softly, to all of them, to none of them, to the mountain that did not care. All right, we go up. Getting them off the canyon floor was the hardest hour of Jessica's life, and it was not the part she would remember. The young woman in the yellow shell could move, it turned out, once the river had not taken her, and a calm voice told her exactly where to put her hands and feet, and she came across the slick shelf on the fixed line, shaking but whole. Her name was Tessa, she said, Tessa Lund, 24, and she would not let go of the waterproof duffel even to climb, looping its strap across her body instead, and when Jessica started to ask, she only said, I have to get these back. They're the last ones, please, in a voice so raw that Jessica let it go and filed it with the camera and the drowned notebook and the rest of what she did not yet understand. Tessa took the dog. That was the arrangement Jessica built in her head as fast as she built the rest. Tessa, light and able, would carry Rin wrapped in the sleeping pad, and Jessica would take Cole on the improvised drag she rigged from the rope bag and 2 trekking poles and a length of webbing, because no one carries a grown man with a possible spine up a mountain on their back, no matter what the movies say, and Tom Ward had not raised a daughter who believed the movies. So they climbed. Out of the granite throat, up the switchbacks, into the thinning timber where the larch gave way to wind-bent fir, and the light went grayer with every 100 feet, and the first hard pellets of snow began to tick against the hood of Jessica's shell. June. Her father had said it like a curse, and he had been right. The front came down off the divide the way fronts did up here, not as weather, but as a verdict, the temperature falling so fast she could feel it on the back of her neck, the canyon below them vanishing into a moving wall of white. Then, from the drag behind her, came a sound that stopped her cold, a dry, rapid chattering, bone on bone, Cole's teeth, and beneath it a low broken rhythm she felt through the webbing in her own hands, his whole body seizing in a hard shuddering wave against the poles, and she turned to see him convulsing in the snow with his eyes rolled white and his back arched off the makeshift sled, and the silence that fell inside her then was the worst silence of the whole long day, because she knew what Cole did to a body that had already given everything, and she knew she was about to lose him to the one enemy she could not fight with a rope. She dropped to her knees in the snow, and she did the only things there were to do. She got him out of the wind behind a fallen trunk. She stripped the wet shell off him and got her own dry layer and the sleeping pad around him, and she pressed her own body along the length of his, sharing what heat she had, holding his head still through the worst of it, counting under her breath the way her father had taught her to count when counting was the only thing left that you controlled. The seizure passed. His breathing went ragged, then steadier. His heart, when she pressed 2 fingers to his throat, was running fast and thin and afraid, and she held there with her hand at his pulse and her cheek near his and willed it to keep its rhythm. Stay, stay, you stubborn man, stay. And slowly, slowly it did. Tessa knelt a few feet off with Rin bundled against her chest, snow gathering in her dark hair, saying nothing, doing the one useful thing a frightened person can do, which is to be quiet and present and ready. And Rin, wrapped and hurting, would not look at the storm or at Tessa. He kept his eyes on Cole. The whole time, through all of it, the old dog watched the unconscious man with a fixed and sorrowful attention, and once, when Cole's breathing caught, Rin gave a single low sound, not a bark, not a whine, something older than both, and Jessica felt the hair rise on her arms and did not know why. Cole's eyes opened. Not all the way, and not for long, but they found her face in the gray light and held there, and the winter flat gray of them had gone soft and unguarded the way it had only when he was too far under to perform. "You're all right," she told him. "Stay still. You're freezing and you cracked your head, but you're all right. Team's coming." "Cold?" he said. "I know. I've got you." His mouth moved into something that was almost the dry, crooked thing from the canyon 100 years ago, before the rock. "That's my line," he managed. "Said it to you, first thing." "You did. You also ignored my anchor advice, so forgive me if I'm running the show now." A long pause. The snow ticked. Then, quietly, from somewhere he could not have reached if he were fully awake. "I always go out alone." It was not an apology and not a boast. It was a confession with no shape around it yet. Every time I told myself it was efficiency, not having to watch somebody else. His eyes closed, opened. There was a kid on my team. "Danny, last deployment. I told him hold the line. Stay back, I had it. He didn't stay back." The breath went out of him. "He stayed because I would have. I taught him that. And he—" The word would not come, and she did not make him find it. She had heard enough men try to finish that sentence to know it had no good ending, and that the trying only opened the wound wider. "So now you go alone," Jessica said softly. "So there's nobody behind you to teach the wrong thing to." He looked at her like she had reached into his chest. Yeah? She held his pulse, and she watched the snow come down, and for a moment she gave him something back, because that was the trade these moments asked, and she had learned a long time ago not to take a man's truth without offering one of her own. "I found my dog on a road 11 years ago," she said. "On my way to a scene I still don't talk about. Worst day I'd had in the job, and there he was, half-starved, waiting like he had an appointment." She glanced at Rin, bundled and watching. "I told myself I rescued him. Took me about a year to understand it was the other way around. He gave me a reason to come home at night that wasn't just clocking out alive." She wiped snow off Cole's brow with her thumb. "You don't have to go out alone, Brennan. You just have to find the thing worth coming back for. Danny didn't follow you because you taught him wrong. He followed you because you were worth following. That's not a debt. That's just love, doing what it does." Cole did not answer. But something in his face let go, a tension she had read in him from the first second on the rocks, and his eyes filled, and he turned his head away into the snow, the way hard men do when they will not be seen. And she let him, keeping her fingers light on the pulse at his throat, keeping count. The snow thickened. The light failed. Jessica thought about her father, who used to crouch beside her on practice slopes when she was 12 and grip her shoulder and say, in the only voice he ever used that frightened her, "The mountain does not bargain, Jess. It does not care how brave you are, or how good or how much you love what you're trying to save. You respect it, or it takes everything. There's no third option." She had hated him for it. She understood now that it had been the most loving thing he ever taught her, because it was true, and the truth was the only thing that had ever kept anyone alive up here. She did not know how long she knelt in the snow with 3 lives gathered around her and the storm pressing down and the dark coming on. Long enough that her hands stopped being cold and started being nothing, which she knew was its own kind of warning. Long enough that she began, quietly, in the place where she did her hardest arithmetic, to do the math she did not want to do. And then Rin lifted his head. He came up out of the bundle in Tessa's arms, with his ears working, staring up the trail into the white. And a half-second later, Jessica saw it too, a smear of light high above them where the trail crested the pass. Swinging, searching, and then a second light beside it, and the faint flat sound of an engine, and a voice carried down on the wind, calling out, "County Rescue, sound off if you can hear us." They had come. The long way, the slow way, over the slide-worn pass and into the teeth of the front, but they had come. Jessica got one arm up and waved it and shouted until her voice broke, and the light swung toward her and steadied. And beside her, his work done, his warning given one last time, Rin lowered his gray head slowly down onto Tessa's arm and closed his amber eyes, his thin sides heaving, all the fierce old strength of him finally, completely spent. Rin had not collapsed in the way that takes a life. Jessica knew the difference before her knees hit the snow beside him, knew it in the steady if exhausted rise and fall of his thin sides, in the way his eyes opened at her touch and found her face, and stayed there. He was an old dog who had spent everything he had, and then a little he did not have, and now the bill had come due all at once, and his body had simply set itself down to pay it. That was all. She pressed her palm flat to his ribs and felt the worn-out engine of his heart still turning over, and she let out a breath she had been holding, it seemed, since the porch that morning 100 years ago. The county team moved over Cole like a single practiced organism, 4 of them in red shells with headlamps cutting cones in the falling snow, and the one running it was a compact woman somewhere past 50 named Deb Hollis, gray blonde hair shoved under a knit cap, a face seamed and ruddy from 30 winters of doing exactly this, with the brisk, unhurried competence of someone who had stopped being impressed by emergencies a long time ago and started simply solving them. She listened to Jessica's handoff, head injury, possible C-spine, hypothermic, witnessed seizure in a few clipped sentences, and she nodded once and said, "Good work keeping him. Most people would have carried him and finished the spine for him. And then she had no more time for praise because there was a man to package and a pass to get back over before the front truly closed. They took Cole. Jessica watched them lift him onto the real litter, the warm one, the one with the heat packs and the straps. And she felt the strange, hollow lurch of handing off a weight you have carried so long your arms have forgotten any other shape. So she did the thing she could still do. She turned to her dog. She worked on Rin in the lee of the fallen trunk, while Deb's team readied Cole for the haul-out, checking the hind leg with hands that knew how, finding the swelling at the hock, the strain rather than the break, the kind of injury an old body could heal if it were given the chance in the rest. She cleared the snow and ice matted into his coat, and it was while she was working, the frozen clumps free from the thick fur at his neck and shoulders, doing it gently, talking to him low the way she had talked to Cole, that her thumb found the thing that stopped her hand. Then her fingers caught on it under the wet fur, a hard ridge of old scarring banding clean across the top of his shoulders and down beneath his chest, too regular to be an accident, too deep to be new, a pattern pressed permanently into him by something he had worn long and hard before she ever knew him. And Jessica went absolutely still in the snow with her hand frozen against her dog's body, the storm and the headlamps and the voices all sliding away, because she had run her hands over this animal 10,000 times in 11 years and somehow never read what was written right there on his skin. She knew harness wear when she felt it. She had seen it on working dogs her whole career. This was not the mark of a collar or a cheap pet rig. This was the deep, even, load-bearing wear of a fitted working harness worn for years, the kind they put on dogs that pulled, that searched, that worked. And higher, when she parted the fur at the inside of his torn right ear, half hidden in the old scar tissue of the tear itself, was a faded shape she had always taken for a birthmark or a healed nick, and was not. It was the ghost of a tattoo, a letter, a partial number, the institutional mark of a dog that had once belonged to a program, a unit, a purpose, worn almost to nothing. But there, 11 years. 11 years of the strange stillness when a certain pitch of sound reached him. 11 years of the way he positioned himself in a room, the way he held a stay like a vow, the way he had paced the riverbank that morning, trying to tell her something in a language she had never learned to read. Dogs keep their histories, her father had said on the porch, looking at Rin with that careful something in his eyes. You just don't always get to read the file. He had known, maybe not the details, but he had known there was a file, and he had let her find it in her own time, which was the most like her father thing she could imagine. She sat back on her heels in the snow and looked at the old dog, laid out exhausted before her, and she understood, finally and all at once, that the animal she had pulled half-starved off a county road 11 years ago had not been a stray that fate dropped in her path. He had been a soldier of some kind, trained, deployed, used up, and then somehow discarded, the way the things that serve us are so often discarded when the serving is done, left to find his own way down to the edge of a road where a 25-year-old woman on the worst day of her life would happen to drive past. He had a whole life before her, a life with a name that was not Rin, hands that were not hers, a purpose she would probably never fully know. And on that road, broken and finished and abandoned, he had lifted his head and looked at her and decided, out of everything left in him, to choose her. A few feet away, half loaded onto the warming litter, Cole Brennan turned his head and watched her without speaking, and she thought of Danny, of the line he would not let go of a man who went out alone so no one would follow him into the dark. Two creatures who had given themselves to something larger and been broken by it, and somehow, against the arithmetic of the world, gotten one more morning. She did not think Rin's life and Cole's were the same story. They were not. But they rhymed here in the snow the way true things sometimes do, and the rhyme of it pressed against her chest until she could hardly breathe. It was Tessa who broke the quiet. She had come close again, the duffel still strapped across her, and she crouched down and looked at Rin with red-rimmed eyes and said, "Is he going to be okay?" And when Jessica nodded, Tessa let out a small, ragged laugh that was mostly relief. And then, as if she finally trusted the morning enough to explain herself, she eased the duffel open. Inside, padded in foam and somehow kept dry through all of it, were a camera body and a stack of memory cards in a waterproof case and a single battered film canister taped shut and labeled in marker. "My grandfather," Tessa said. "He photographed this canyon for 40 years. He passed in the spring. These were his last rolls, the ones he never got to develop. He always said the light at Sweetgrass in June was the only thing he'd ever seen worth nearly dying for." She wiped her face. "I came to finish his last shot from the shelf where he used to stand. I'm sorry. I didn't know the water. I didn't know." Below them on the pass, headlights swung and steadied, and a man's voice called Tessa's name into the snow, her father, who had driven up behind the rescue team half out of his mind, and Tessa stood and stumbled toward him and was gathered into arms that shook, the stake of the whole long day closing quietly, the way real things close, without ceremony. Jessica stayed in the snow with her hand on Rin's ribs. The old dog had watched all of it, the litter, the reunion, the storm, and now he turned his gray muzzle and laid it against her knee, and his amber eyes found hers and held, the way they had on the road 11 years ago, the way they had that very morning when he pulled her toward a canyon before any human ear could hear the cry. You knew, she thought, looking at the faded ghost of the mark on him, at everything she had never asked. Some part of you always knew the way down to the water. You just needed somebody worth leading there. The snow came down soft and forgiving over all of them, and Jessica Ward, who had spent her whole life learning to read the things people tried to hide, sat very still and let herself, for once, simply be read. 3 weeks later, the snow on Hatcher Pass was only a memory the high peaks still wore, and June had come back to Larkspur Hollow the way it should have come the first time, warm and unhurried and green to the edges of everything. The North Fork had dropped and gentled. The dogwood along the fence had finished its white extravagance and gone to leaf. And on the back porch of Tom Ward's house, in the long gold light of a Saturday evening, a small and improbable family had gathered around a table that had not seen this many plates in years. Jessica had cooked, which her father pretended to find alarming, and ate 3 helpings of anyway. There was elk stew, thick with the last of the winter potatoes, and cornbread, and a pie. Deb Hollis had sent over with a note that read for the agent who knew not to carry him, which Tom had read aloud twice with great satisfaction. The screen door stood open to the warm evening, and Rin lay in his place at the threshold where he could see both the table and the yard, his bad leg stretched out straight before him, healing on its own slow schedule, exactly the way Jessica had known it would if she only gave it the chance and the rest. That was the part that pressed quietly on her chest, even in the warmth of the evening. He was healing, but he was not the dog he had been 3 weeks ago, and they both knew it, in the wordless way she and the old shepherd had always known things about each other. The hip that used to stiffen only in damp weather stiffened now most mornings. He took the porch steps, one careful foot at a time, where he used to flow down them. He slept deeper and woke slower. The canyon hadn't broken him, but it had spent something in him that would not be coming back, the way a hard winter spends an old tree, and what was left was no less alive and no less his, only nearer now to the far edge of itself. She did not let herself look too long at that edge, but she had stopped pretending she could not see it. Cole came up the drive a little before sundown, moving stiff but moving on his own, the shaved patch above his ear grown back to stubble over the line of stitches, the winter gray of his eyes carrying something it had not carried on the rocks that first morning. He had stayed in the valley to heal, taken a room in town, and somewhere in those 3 weeks the man who went out alone had started, awkwardly and against the grain of a lifetime, accepting rides and casseroles and the company of people who refused to let him be a burden in private. He carried a six-pack in one hand and a paper sack in the other, and he stopped at the bottom of the steps when he saw Rin, the way he always stopped now, and waited to be acknowledged before he came up. Rin thumped his tail twice against the boards. Permission granted. "He likes you," Jessica said. "I don't know what that says about his judgment." "It says he has taste." Cole eased himself into the empty chair, wincing only a little. "Hollis send pie?" "She did, with a note insulting you." "Good, I was worried she'd gone soft." But his eyes had found Rin again, and the lightness in his voice didn't quite reach them. He set the paper sack on the table and pushed it toward her without quite looking at it. That's for him, and for you, I guess. And inside was a fleece-lined bed, the good kind, orthopedic, the kind made for old joints and long sleep. Jessica looked at it and then at Cole and found she could not say anything at all, and Cole, mercifully, filled the silence the way men like him did, with deflection. "Vet in town said the floor's no good for a dog his age. So," he cleared his throat. "Anyway." Then, from the doorway, a sound broke the evening open. Not a bark, not a whine, but that low, old, wordless note Rin had made twice in the canyon, the one that had raised the hair on Jessica's arms, and they all turned to see the old dog with his head lifted and his ears working, staring out across the darkening yard at nothing any of them could see. His whole body gone still and listening the way it had on the porch. The morning everything began. And for one suspended breath, the table held its silence, and Jessica's heart climbed into her throat, waiting to learn whether the world was about to ask something terrible of them all over again. And then a doe stepped out of the tree line at the edge of the yard, ears up, picking her careful way through the long grass toward the river, and behind her a spotted fawn on stilt legs, and Rin watched them pass with his old soldier's attention, and then, satisfied that the perimeter held nothing that needed him, laid his gray head back down on his paws with a sigh that seemed to come from the bottom of him. The breath went out of the whole table at once. Tom started to laugh first, a low rumble, and then Cole, and then Jessica, the helpless, shaky laughter of people who have been frightened by nothing and are grateful beyond reason for the nothing. "Perimeter's clear," Tom announced, wiping his eyes. "Stand down, Sergeant." Later, when the plates were cleared and the light had gone violet over the peaks, and Tom had drifted inside to argue with the television, Jessica and Cole sat with the quiet between them and watched the first stars come up over the larch. She told him then the things she had found in the snow, the harness scar and the faded mark in the torn ear, the whole life Rin had lived before her. Cole listened the way he did everything now, carefully all the way to the end. "You going to look into it?" he asked. "Find out where he came from, what he was." Jessica had thought about it for 3 weeks. She had the skills and the access, and it would not have been hard. "No," she said, and was surprised by how certain it came out. "I thought about it, but whatever he was, whoever had him, they used him up and they let him go. That part of his story already ended. The part I'm in." She looked at the old dog asleep in the doorway. "That one's still going. I don't need the file. I just need the dog." She glanced at Cole. "Same goes for some people, I think. You don't have to dig up everything you lost to be allowed to put something down." Cole was quiet a long moment. "Danny had a sister," he said finally. "She's written me a few times over the years. I never wrote back. Couldn't figure out what a letter from me was worth." He turned the bottle slowly in his hands. "I think I'm going to write her. Tell her what he was like, that last deployment. The good parts, she should have the good parts." He said it simply, the way men say the hardest things, as though they were ordinary, and Jessica understood that something had finally been set down on the long climb out of that canyon that he had been carrying a great deal longer than one cold June morning. "That's worth a letter," she said. "More than." The fawn and the doe had melted back into the dark. Somewhere down at the water, an owl tried out its first question of the night. And Jessica thought about the strange arithmetic of the whole thing, how a girl of 25 on the worst day of her life had pulled over for a broken dog who turned out to have been waiting. How that dog had spent 11 years quietly steering her toward home and had, on one bright cold morning, lifted his gray head and pulled her toward a canyon before any human ear could hear the cry, and in doing so had thrown a rope to a drowning stranger and to a man drowning in something the eye could not see. She did not believe in much that she could not document, but she had stopped pretending she could explain her dog. Some part of him had always known the way down to the water. He had only ever needed someone worth leading there. Maybe that was all any of them needed. Maybe that was the whole of it. When full dark came, Cole headed home, and Tom went up to bed, and Jessica stood alone at the open door with the old dog at her feet. For years this porch had stayed dark after sundown, because there had been no particular reason to light it, and because the dark asked nothing of her. Tonight she reached over and flipped the switch, and the porch light came on, gold and steady, spilling out across the boards, and the steps, and the new fleece bed, and the gray muzzle of the dog who had brought so much home. Rin rose, slow and careful on his healing leg, and crossed to lean his weight against her knee, and the two of them stood there a while in the warm light at the edge of the great dark valley, the river running cold and patient below, the peaks keeping their old watch above, and neither of them in any hurry at all to go inside. Sometimes the thing that saves us does not come the way we expect. Sometimes it comes on 4 tired legs, out of a life we'll never fully know, carrying a truth no words can reach, asking only to be let in. Jessica didn't get to keep that morning or undo what the years had already spent in her old friend. But through him she got something quieter and just as sacred, the chance to be chosen, to be led home, and to leave the porch light on one more night. If this story found a soft place in your heart tonight, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and who your own Rin has been. And if you believe these small, faithful lights are still worth telling stories about, consider subscribing and staying a while. May your house be warm tonight, and may something loyal rest beside your door. If you have stayed with Jessica and Rin all the way to the end, then you already understand what this story was really about. It was never only about a rescue in a cold Montana canyon. It was about the quiet truth that some of the greatest blessings in our lives do not arrive the way we expect them to. They do not come dressed in glory. Sometimes they come on 4 tired legs, half-starved at the edge of a road, carrying a whole history we will never fully know, asking only to be let in. We so often believe that we are the ones doing the saving. The truth, more often than not, is the other way around. Jessica thought she rescued a broken dog on the worst day of her life. It took her 11 years to understand that the dog had been sent to rescue her, to give her a reason to come home, to lead her toward the very places where her hands and her heart were needed most. That is not coincidence. Those who have loved an animal know this in a place deeper than words. An animal's loyalty, its strange and faithful knowing, the way it seems to sense a storm or a sorrow before we do, these are not small things. They are, perhaps, one of the gentle ways that God reminds us we are never walking alone, because that is the quiet mercy of it. The Lord does not always remove the hard climb, the cold front, the grief we carry up the mountain. But again and again, He sends something faithful to walk beside us. A friend who stays, a stranger who refuses to leave us in the river, an old dog who lifts his gray head and pulls us toward home before we can even hear the cry for help. Healing rarely comes as a thunderclap. It comes the way it came to Cole, one honest letter at a time. It comes the way it came to Jessica, one porch light turned back on after years of darkness, small, steady, worth more than gold. So let this be the lesson we carry out of the canyon and into our own ordinary days. Be kind to the broken thing beside the road, because you never know what it was sent to give you. Pull over for the stranger Stay behind for the friend who is drowning in something the eye cannot see. Light the porch again, even after the long dark years, because someone or something may still be looking for a reason to come home. And love the faithful creature at your feet while you have it, for the time we are given together is a gift, and gifts are meant to be cherished, not counted. If this story touched something in your heart tonight, please share it with someone who needs to be reminded that they are not alone and that love still finds a way home. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from and the name of the loyal companion who has walked beside you in your own life. I would be honored to read every one, and if you believe these small faithful lights are still worth telling stories about, consider subscribing and staying with us a while longer. May God bless you and keep you. May He light your path through every cold front and steep climb, send something faithful to walk beside you, and lead you safely home. And may peace rest in your house tonight, like a loyal old friend asleep beside your door.